Last time we spoke about the situation after the disastrous losses at Pyongyang and the Yalu River, as well as the battle for Port Arthur. Coming off their tremendous success at Pyongyang and the Battle of Yalu, the Japanese performed an offensive, fording the Yalu and easily defeating the Qing forces at Juliancheng. After this, the Japanese began to advance into the Liaodong Peninsula, and one by one, each town saw Qing forces fleeing while giving little battle. Eventually, the Japanese seized Jinzhou and Dalian. With such bases of operations in hand, they could go and attack the formidable fortress of Port Arthur. As the Japanese advanced into the Port Arthur region, they came across mutilated corpses of their comrades, driving a very fiery need for vengeance into their hearts. The Japanese would take Port Arthur with absolute ease as the Qing yet again fled the scene, but this time the victory was met with a disastrous massacre. This episode is the First Sino-Japanese War Part 5, the Battle of Weihaiwei. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over on my channel, I just released a tier list ranking generals of the Pacific War. Some really silly stuff. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And over there, you can find exclusive podcasts, such as my series on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident, and the author of the Final War Theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. The massacre at Port Arthur was disastrous for Japan's public image. Thomas Cohen of the London Times went to Hiroshima on his way home after witnessing the massacre, and he met with the foreign minister, Mutsu Manomitsu, to tell him what he saw personally. Upon hearing the story, Mutsu told him that an investigation would be made and that he showed no disposition to interfere with the correspondent's duty, and reports were telegraphed on December the 1st. On December the 16th, the Japanese Foreign Ministry issued a formal statement to the foreign press on the matter. The Japanese government desires no concealment of the events at Port Arthur. On the contrary, it is investigating rigidly for the purpose of fixing the exact responsibility and is taking measures essential to the reputation of the empire. Japanese troops, transported with rage at the mutilation of their comrades by the enemy, broke through all restraints, and exasperated by the wholesale attempts by the Chinese soldiers at escaping, disguised as citizens, they inflicted vengeance without discrimination. While the Japanese government deplores the excessive violence, it protested exaggerations in the press reports that insisted that the victims, almost without exception, were soldiers wearing the stolen clothes of citizens. 3 days later, the London Times would say this: that most foreign reporters agree that the excesses were committed, but say that they were excusable, and that they had their parallels in the best European armies. The Japanese military promised they would also launch an inquiry into the matter, but no one ended up being punished. Luckily for Japan, the West would later on become obsessed over the peace terms, and their attention was less focused on the Port Arthur massacre. Meanwhile, the Qing government was trying to deny there even was a defeat at Port Arthur, let alone any massacre. The Shanghai China Gazette had this to say: the most strenuous efforts have been made by the Chinese officials to conceal the fact that the great stronghold has passed out of their hands and is now a de facto Japanese naval yard. Telegraphic notices have been sent, all over the empire by the officials saying that a wicked report has been sent on foot by the enemy that they have captured Port Arthur, but it was utterly untrue. The place being garrisoned by 30,000 brave Chinese soldiers who would never give it up to the Japanese. Official telegrams to this effect were published today in all the native papers, and thousands of Chinese will thereby be kept in blissful ignorance of the terrible position in which China stands today. Ostrich-like, most of the Chinese prefer not to believe the unpleasant truth, and rather listen to the barefaced mendacity of their wretched rulers. But the stupidity of the later gentry who have brought the country to its present desperate plight is only emphasized by this false maneuver. A month later, the same China Gazette would assert this. By many, it is not yet known or admitted that Port Arthur has been taken and is held by the Japanese. Even of the well-informed officials, the same is said to be true in Beijing. Of course, the Qing court had good reason to try and conceal the defeat at Port Arthur. The Mandate of Heaven was under attack. The Japanese were pouring into the Manchu homelands of Manchuria. Internal rebellions could spring up at any moment. Everything seemed to be hanging from a thread. After the defeats at Pyongyang and Yalu, Emperor Guangxu demanded to take personal control over the prosecution of war in Korea. He even wanted to leave the throne under Empress Dowager Cixi, so that he could concentrate on the front lines. But his advisors pretty much put their foot down on that one. The Manchu leadership needed to maintain their control over national security, and luckily for them, and unluckily for Liaodong, they had a scapegoat for disasters. In October of 1894, just before losing Port Arthur, Prince Gong had been reinstated. A decade earlier, he had been demoted because of the disastrous losses during the Sino-French War, but in reality, Cixi just considered him a rival. He was appointed High Commissioner of the Peking Field Forces, co-president with Prince Ching of the Admiralty, the Yamen, and of the War Operations. Yes, the age-old tradition of tossing a ton of titles on a single person. The Qing government even created for him a small general headquarters. Prince Gong was the sixth son of the Daogun Emperor, uncle-in-law of Cixi, and alongside Liaodong, one of China's top experts on foreign affairs. The foreign community respected him ever since the Second Opium War. Prince Qing had been the head of the Yamen since 1887. Thus, two Manchu princes, Gong and Qing, were in control of the capital's defenses. Gong and Liaodong were sharing responsibilities for the war, but Gong was specifically only responsible for the defense of the capital, while Liaodong retained responsibility for prosecuting the war against Japan. After the fall of Port Arthur, Liaodong went to the Qing court seeking punishment, and within 24 hours he was deprived of all of his titles, honors, and office. Big ouch. And when all was said and done, he remained at his post. As the New York Times headlines stated at the time, Viceroy Liaodong has lost the rest of his wardrobe. The foreign press had learnt much about China's practice of degrading and punishing officials, while simultaneously not actually implementing any real policy change. Liaodong would retain his post throughout the war, regardless of the titles and honors. He really was just a scapegoat. And it's not like he was not aware of this. Upon receiving his punishments, he began to toss mud at other Qing officials, blaming them for resisting railroad construction plans, as now they were direly needed to deploy troops. He would also go on the record to complain naval funds had not been so forthcoming. Basically, it was a big old Liaodong I told you so moment. Colonel Maurice of the British Royal Artillery was very blunt when he said, Liaodong is being treated as a scapegoat. He is the only man in China who has advocated European methods, and he is now being punished on account of the failure of the old conservatives who refused to follow his advice. Now back to the front lines. After taking Port Arthur, the Japanese did not rest long to continue their sweep towards Beijing. but the next important target was actually going to be the naval base at Weihaiwei. There was also suggestions amongst the Japanese military leadership to perform a winter campaign in Manchuria as a diversion. The thought process being to hit the Manchu homeland to divert many of their land forces away from the shores of Bohai and Shandong. The Qing had divided their forces in Manchuria into 3 armies, forming a line between the coastline at Gaiping all the way to Liaoyang. The northmost army was stationed at Liaoyang. They were to defend the road to Mukden from the east via the Motian Pass, and the south via Haicheng. If you pull up a map, you will notice the Motian Pass forms this bottleneck between Fenhuangcheng and Liaoyang. The second army took up a position at the port city of Nuanzheng and the walled city of Haicheng. Lastly, the third army, commanded by General Song Qing, was positioned at Gaiping. Now, back at the end of October, Marshal Yamagata was pursuing Qing forces, and his 5th Division seized Fangguangcheng unopposed. Their next objective was Haicheng. By taking this, they would enable the 1st IJA in eastern Manchuria and the 2nd IJA advancing up the Liaodong Peninsula to link up communications. It would also cut off the Qing in 3 directions, leaving them only a westward retreat. After Fangguangcheng fell, General Song ordered 10,000 of his forces to advance to the Motian Pass, threatening the rear lines of the Japanese marching upon Haicheng. This prompted General Nozu Michitsura to move his 10th Brigade to the Motian Pass to prevent the Qing from concentrating over there. He was successful, repelling the Qing forces gathering there, and by late November, the Qing were routing. From there, the Japanese were forced to pull back to Fangguangcheng to resupply. But in that time period, the Qing began to reconcentrate at the Motian Pass. Then the Qing launched an offensive at Fangguangcheng, but were served 2 terrible defeats on December the 9th and the 14th. While all this was going on, the 5th Brigade under General Katsuro Taro was pursuing a Qing army led by General Ma, around 6,000 men strong, who looked like they were going to go attack Port Arthur. Katsuro pursued Ma's forces to Haicheng, where he not only defeated them, he also seized the city by December the 13th. The capture of Haicheng had ruined General Song's plans. Now the Qing line of defense was cut in 2 by a Japanese army. General Song was forced to reestablish a new defensive line. On the 18th of December, he ordered 10,000 of his forces to storm the town of Liaocheng, but they were intercepted along the way by the IJA 5th Brigade. They were forced to withdraw, suffering 500 casualties versus 440 for the Japanese. The very next day, the Japanese attacked the retreating Qing forces around Gangwangjiai, a town just southwest of Haicheng. The Qing put up a stiff resistance, but they were forced to give ground. This prevented General Song's armies from reaching the road to Liaoyang to connect them with the other Qing armies to the north. The Qing would try 4 times to retake Haicheng during January and February to no avail. Then on January the 10th, the 2nd IJA launched a 3-pronged attack upon the walled city of Gaiping. The city's 5,000-strong garrison fought for their lives. They had actually prepared for the attack by causing the water in the nearby streams next to the city to freeze on an incline, making it very difficult for the Japanese to cross. While this tactic would have been highly effective centuries ago, with modern artillery it was undercut gravely. The Qing would suffer 1,200 casualties defending Gaiping, while inflicting 307 upon the Japanese. 10,000 Qing reinforcements were arriving to the scene from Yingkao, whereupon they found the retreating garrison, and this tossed everything into a panic. But to the relief of General Song, the Japanese temporarily halted their advance, due to overstretching their logistical lines. Now the Japanese had an enormous supply route going all the way from Juliancheng to Haicheng and Gaiping. General Song Qing would not give up, and he launched a major counteroffensive to try and retake Gaiping and Haicheng. 20,000 Qing forces stormed into the region, and they were beaten back mostly by the 5th Brigade. General Song's men received 300 casualties for their efforts while inflicting only 41 upon the Japanese. Undeterred, General Song tossed 2 more offensives between January the 17th and the 21st of February. The offensives greatly strained his men, and just when their logistical supply lines were beginning to suffer, General Naozu prepared his counteroffensive. On the 16th of February, as 15,000 Qing soldiers attacked Haicheng in 3 columns led by Generals Jiang Xin, Ai Ko Tang, and Xu, They would also be aided by bandit forces the next day. On the 21st, the Qing bombarded Haicheng with artillery, while they received reinforcements in the form of 10,000 men under Governor Wu Dacheng from Shanhaiguan. Meanwhile, the Japanese were also reinforced by elements of the 1st Division. On the 21st, the 1st Division, led by General Yamaji, assaulted a large hill named Tapingshan, being defended by forces led by General Ma Yuquin. By the 24th, General Yamaji seized the hill, forcing the Qing to take up new positions in a nearby village, and soon Yamaji unleashed artillery from the hilltop upon them. The Qing had to withdraw from the area after receiving 800 casualties. The fighting was extremely rough for the hill, not to mention the winter conditions costing the Japanese 250 casualties from combat and another 1,500 cases of frostbite. Yes, one could argue Mother Nature was doing more damage to the Japanese than the Chinese. On the 28th, General Nozu Michisure unleashed his counterattack aimed at Liaodong and Liaoyang. He began with a large artillery bombardment, then sent his forces in a wide front offensive. The Qing defenders were driven into a rout, many retreating north towards Qingzhou, offering only rearguard actions as they did so. Lieutenant General Katsura Taro pursued some of the retreating Qing all the way to the walls of Liaoyang, reaching it by March the 3rd, while his main bulk, the 3rd and 5th Divisions under General Nozu, advanced upon Nuizhang and Liaoyang, eventually by the 4th of March. During the rout, the Qing had taken another 400 casualties while inflicting 124 upon the Japanese. General Song then tossed 2,500 men led by General Xu at Haicheng, and yet again only to be repelled by the IJA 1st Division. On March the 3rd, the 3rd and 5th IJA Divisions began their assault in Liaozhang by first softening up the city with some artillery barrage for over 2 hours. The artillery barrage did more than soften up the city. All the Qing defenders abandoned their wall positions and moved into the interior, a very poor decision. The Japanese 5th Division entered the city with zero resistance to find 2,000 of the 5,000 Hui army troops defending Liaozhang were fleeing. Those who stayed and fought, they fought fiercely against the 6,000 men of the 5th IJA Division. But in the end, they were also forced to abandon Liaozhang, after an astounding 1,900 deaths. 633 Qing defenders were taken prisoner. The Japanese were forced to destroy nearly all the buildings in the city using their artillery to smoke out Qing defenders, and this goes on well into the night. By 11 p.m., the Qing have all but departed the city. While the battle over Liaozhang was occurring, the 1st and 3rd Divisions began an attack against Yingkao. General Song, under threat of encirclement, was forced to withdraw from Yingkao over to Tianzhongtai. By March the 7th, the battle for Yingkao became nothing more than sporadic resistance, and so the port city fell with relative ease. At the port in Yingkao, the Japanese seized the gunboat Meiyuan and 2 transports that were icebound. General Song rallied another 11,000 men at Tianzhongtai to continue launching counteroffensives, but General Nozu kept up the pace to hinder the Qing from recuperating. The 5th Brigade was left to garrison Liaozhang and Yingkao as the rest of the Japanese advanced upon Tianzhongtai. The Qing were taken off balance by this as they tried to put up a defense, but they were utterly defeated, resulting in 2,000 casualties, and they lost their entire artillery force, which was captured by the Japanese. The Japanese losses, as reported by the Japanese, mind you, were unbelievably low. They said they had 16 deaths and 144 wounded. As a result of this last defeat, General Song's army ceased to exist as a real force. Full-scale combat in Manchuria pretty much ended with the capture of Tianzhongtai, though minor skirmishes would occur in hill areas with pockets of Qing resistance. The victory over Yingkao gave the Japanese complete control over the southeastern portion of Manchuria, and when April came around, Yingkao's harbor would be ice-free, allowing for further supply lines via the sea. The Japanese had thus acquired a base of operations to perform offensives within Jiuli province, and thus the road to Beijing was open. The offensive against Beijing would see the 1st and 3rd Divisions of the 1st IJA marching towards Shanhaiguan, while the 5th Division would garrison parts of Manchuria, and the 2nd and 6th Divisions would be held in reserve around Dalian. At this point, Emperor Guangxu began shuffling officials. Li Hangjiang was relieved of his command in the field, and this was handed over to a 6-man-strong committee of defense, headed by Prince Chun. Alongside this, Li Hangjiang's viceroyship over Juli province, something that he had held for a quarter of a century by this point, was handed over to Liu Kunyi. Liu Kunyi tried to pretend he was too ill to take the appointment, and would remain in Beijing through January of 1895, continuously trying to weasel his way out of his new post. And I certainly don't blame him for doing this. Rumors began to emerge that Liu Kunyi was an opium addict, which was not unheard of. Generals like Ye Jiqiao and Weihaiwei were known opium addicts. Despite his attempts to thwart it, Liu Kunyi was now commanding the Xiang army, composed of large numbers of Hunanese and Hubei forces. By December the 28th, Liu Kunyi was made commander-in-chief of the imperial armies within and outside the Great Wall, including the territories of Juli, Shandong, and Manchuria. The Defense Committee had organized 50,000 men for the defense of Juli, stationing them around Shahanguan, with another 55,000 around Beijing. This meant Liu Kunyi had a whopping 105,000 men under his command, with 80,000 of the provincial forces within the theater of operations. General Song Qing, meanwhile, still held command over 35,000 men in Manchuria, alongside another general who was commanding 10,000 men at Liaoyang. As all of the shuffling was going on for the Qing, the Japanese did not simply lay idle. Their primary objective remained Weihaiwei, and in January of 1895, as their forces were marching through Manchuria slowly towards Beijing, they split up the 2nd IGA. In the 3rd week of January, the entire 2nd Division and most of the 6th were handed over to Marshal Oyama, who redeployed them across the Yellow Sea to Shandong province in preparation for an assault upon Weihaiwei. Now, when the Japanese attacked Port Arthur, they did so intending to take her naval facilities intact so that they could use them. But for Weihaiwei, the goal would be much different. The Japanese intended to destroy the Beiyang fleet within her port, so that the seaways would no longer be under threat, thus allowing Japan to move troops at will, though by this point they basically had already achieved this. The advance upon Weihaiwei began with a diversionary bombardment of the outlying town of Dongzhou on January the 18th. Dongzhou was roughly 100 miles west of Weihaiwei, and its defenses consisted of 4 210mm guns and 6 150mm guns. The purpose of the diversionary attack was to turn the Qing attention westward, while the Japanese landed forces 30 miles east of Weihaiwei at the easternmost tip of the Liaodong Peninsula known as Rongcheng. The Japanese forces departed Dalian on January the 19th and 22nd, landing between the 20th and the 23rd. Dongzhou was bombarded by the cruisers Naniwa, Akitsushima, and Yoshino as the 2nd IJA forces led by General Oyama landed at Rongcheng. His 2nd IJA consisted of the 6th Division under General Kuroki Tamemoto and the 2nd Division under Lieutenant General Sakuma Samada. The 2nd IJA divided into 2 columns marching west towards Weihaiwei, one over a coastal road, the other 4 miles further inland. The Japanese ushered in the Chinese New Year by timing the invasion of Weihaiwei for January the 29th. It was the most important holiday to the Chinese, and perhaps the Japanese chose it specifically to not only surprise the Chinese, but also to hammer in a message, that being that the old days were finished. Wake up and modernize or suffer dire consequences. Once in the vicinity of Weihaiwei, the Japanese performed a 3-pronged attack upon the landward fortifications south and east of the town. Weihaiwei had 3 categories of defense: those on the 2 harbor islands, those on the mainland overlooking the northwestern entrance to the harbor, and those on the mainland overlooking the southeastern entrance to the harbor. These fortifications were equipped with the best artillery available, a total of 161 guns, between 7 to 24 centimeters worth, mostly of Krupp and Armstrong design. The northern forts had 43 guns. Liugongdao Island had 61 guns. Ridao Island had 8 guns. The southern forts had 49 guns, and the harbor itself held 15 Beiyang warships, 13 torpedo boats, and 248 sea mines and boom nets. Nearly 11,000 Qing soldiers defended the city, with another 4,000 or so on their way from Tianjin, but they would not make it in time. The troops were led by Admiral Ding and commander of the Tingyuan, Liu Buqian. The two Beiyang commanders had little faith in the Qing soldiers under their disposal. They only really trusted the sailors of the Beiyang fleet. The IJN combined fleet had dispatched a naval patrol outside Weihaiwei's harbor, threatening any ships that tried to escape with torpedo attacks, leaving the entire Beiyang fleet all bottled up. The weather conditions hit as low as -6, with severe blizzards, thus terrible for incoming Japanese, but a typical summer for us Canadians. Sorry, I had to. The most outlying forts were hit first by Japanese artillery. This resulted in a 9-hour-long fight until the Qing defenders abandoned the forts, leaving them all nearly intact. During the storming of the outlying forts, Major General Odera Yasuzumi, leading the 11th Infantry Regiment, was hit by shrapnel from a shell fired from the Jiyuan. Odera would die from his wounds, and he became the only Japanese general to die in combat during the war, and the highest-ranking Japanese death of the war. He would be posthumously promoted to 3rd Court rank, and his son was ennobled with the title of Danchaku, Baron. With the outlying forts seized, the Japanese began turning them upon Weihaiwei itself, battering it before the men stormed Weihaiwei on February the 2nd. I would assume at this point it's probably no surprise to any of you listeners that the Japanese entered the city to find the garrison had fled the night before. Yes, Ding Ruchang had every reason not to have much faith in the Qing soldiers there. It turned out when the siege began, the Chinese hospital staff were the first to leave, leaving some foreigners to try and take over the medical services. Admiral Ding Ruchang only succeeded in having a few of the forts surrounding the harbor destroyed before the Japanese simply grabbed them. And thus, now the very guns that were meant to protect the Beiyang fleet, trapped within the harbor, were unleashed upon them. To make matters even worse, on the night of February the 3rd, the Japanese tried to remove the booms blocking the entrance to the harbor, but they were unable to. The following night, they tried again, and this time they were successful, allowing 2 squadrons of torpedo boats to enter the harbor. 2 IJN torpedo boats began opening fire to cause a distraction as others snuck in to try and torpedo the Dingyuan. The Dingyuan received crippling damage as 3 other Qing warships were sunk. The following night, a squadron of IJN torpedo boats made repeated attacks upon the largest Qing warships at anchor, disabling 2 and a transport. By February the 7th, the IJA and the IJN were launching combined bombardment attacks upon the Beiyang fleet. In response, the Qing torpedo boats, not already disabled, tried to make a break for it, unsuccessfully running into the IJN blockade outside of the harbor. Out of 13 ships, 6 were destroyed and 7 would be captured, intact by the Japanese. As defeat was all but certain, Admiral Ito Sukiyuki tried to make an appeal to Admiral Ding Ruchang, who happened to be his personal friend. He wrote a letter urging his old friend to come back with him to Japan. He advised Ding to prevent any further loss of life by capitulating and to accept political asylum in Japan until the war's end, and he assured him he would be able to return to his native land and could secure China's future by setting up new policies. It is not the fault of one man that has brought China into the position she now occupies. The blame rests with the errors of the government that has long administered her affairs. She selects her servants by competitive examination, and literary attainments are the test. In the modern age, China owes her preservation and her integrity today wholly to the fact that she then, 30 years ago, broke away from the old and attached herself to the new. Now, Admiral Ding, despite being the admiral of the Beiyang fleet, in a typical Qing fashion was greatly out of his element. He had formerly been a cavalry officer. He actually had little naval training at all. He was not even very popular amongst the sailors. He was a man of Anhui province, and most naval officers hailed from Fujian. As was so typical, the Qing dynasty favored loyalties rather than military experience. Thus, this led Ding to where he was. He resisted capitulation until the very end, and he had actually tried to die in action multiple times by standing on the deck when bombardments were occurring. According to a foreign advisor, Ding declared at first that capitulation was impossible, but later he said he could arrange it by committing suicide and so save the lives of many. Now, depending on the sources you read, he chose to kill himself, or his sailors actually prodded it to him with knives in hand. Admiral Ding killed himself via opium overdose, followed by Admiral Liu Buchan and Captain Yang Yonglin, who had shot himself as the Japanese boarded the Qing. Admiral Ding had no choice but to kill himself, as Emperor Guangxu had already degraded him the summer prior for not preventing the IJN from entering Bohai. After the fall of Port Arthur, the emperor degraded him again and tried to bring him to the board of punishment where he would have been beheaded, had it not been for Li Hangzhang intervening on his behalf. Before killing himself, Ding wrote back to Ito, "I am thankful for the admiral's friendship, but I cannot forsake my duties to the state. The only thing now remaining for me to do is to die." Liu Buchan, before doing the same, had ordered the scuttling of as many of the Beiyang warships as possible with explosives. Command of the Beiyang fleet fell onto the Scottish-born Vice Admiral John McClure, who wrote a letter of surrender in Admiral Ding's name on the morning of February the 12th. As per the terms of the letter, the remaining ships, forts, and stores were surrendered to the Japanese at the request all the Qing troops, civilians, and foreign advisors would be allowed to depart unmolested. Admiral Ding's suicide wiped away the stain of defeat and made him a strategic war hero to both China and to Japan. The Japanese admired his final act since it fit within their Bushido code. Admiral Ding, alongside the other commanders who committed suicide, were honored by the Japanese. They accorded them full military honors and granted their men extraordinary leniency. An American professor who taught English in Japan shortly after the war wrote of the event, explaining its significance to Western audiences. "What would have been the feelings of the North for Robert E. Lee if at Appomattox, when the South capitulated to the North at the end of the American Civil War, rather than share the fate of the gallant men he had surrendered, he had committed suicide from a sense of devoted patriotism. Instead of admiring him for the unsullied hero and knightly character that he was, North and South alike would have despised him. And yet 9 out of 10 of my Japanese schoolboys wrote of the suicide of Admiral Ding as the noblest thing of which they had ever heard." The letter of capitulation would be the first one handed over to the Japanese without the use of the term boren. Later on, when the war was officially over, the Qing soldiers and officers signed promises not to take any further part in the war, and they were set free by the Japanese. The officers were provided safe passage aboard the gunboat Kanji, which carried the bodies of Ding Ruchang and the other dead captains. The IJN went out of their way to fly flags at half-mast, and the flagship fired a long salute as the boat bearing Ding's body left port. The fall of Port Arthur had been Empress Dowager's birthday present from Japan. Li Hangzhang's present had come on February the 12th with the fall of Weihaiwei and 3 days short of his 72nd birthday. Back in Beijing, upon hearing the news of Weihaiwei's fall, Emperor Guangxu, in a fit of rage, authorized the governor of Shandong province to behead all fugitives without requiring to report back to the capital. The New York Times said of the event, "Emulating Alice's Wonderland Queen, China's emperor says, Weihaiwei defenders, off with their heads." Some of the Qing leadership began advising the court they should hire foreign mercenaries or even engage Chinese fishermen to attack the Japanese home islands. For men like these, the modern era had simply not dawned upon them. In reality, China should have offered peace negotiations after losing Port Arthur. But for many members of the Qing elite, this was unthinkable, as allegedly murmured by some, "Dwarves could not possibly bring China to her knees." On the eve of the offensive against Weihaiwei, Governor Wu Dacheng, who now held the titles of Assistant Imperial Commissioner of Defense, President of the Board of War, Vice President of the Court of Congress, Governor of Hunan, and Officer of the Premier Button, made an official proclamation to the Japanese. It was he who offered surrender. In his words, "I, of a charitable state of mind, and so could not bear to see Japanese troops going to destruction before my fresh battalions in this severe cold. Meanwhile, the Japanese publicly reported their objectives of war were not yet attained, and that the Diet was prepared to grant whatever amounts were necessary for military expenses required to finish them. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. And over there, I've just released my tier list on generals of the Pacific War. It is quite a silly one. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is part 4 in my series on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author behind the Final War theory. Please check it out, it would mean a lot to me. The Japanese had defeated countless Qing armies within Manchuria, and now had neutralized China's last great naval port of Weihaiwei. Would the Qing court bend the knee to the Japanese, or would they choose to continue to fight?